In this episode, add some new libraries like Minimason and SimpleCSS. Then we'll talk about how Rust is taking over the web. Plus, we'll look at some major new frameworks like Remix and Iles. And then I'll show you a demo of WindiCSS, a contender that offers some improvements over TailwindCSS. It's not in your mind. The pace of the web is relentless. So to keep up, it's time for the Toolbox. Hello everyone, this is Ray Villalobos and I stream about front-end and full-stack tools Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Pacific. So follow me and subscribe on all the social media things. If you want to catch any past episodes, make sure you take a look at my blog at raybo.org. So we're back this week and I'm still trying out this new sort of framework that really is not a framework. I'm really trying out this new way of streaming called Ecamm Live. So let me know if there's any problems. I'd love to hear what frameworks you're into and what you like about the show. Now, I usually start off with a segment called Shorts. I'm thinking about changing the name because Shorts means something in YouTube. So maybe something like Bits. However, I have to redo some of the graphics. So I don't know. Maybe next week you'll see a completely new, different branding for that section of it. So let's go ahead and get started with the Shorts. All right, so this week we're going to take a look at a number of different libraries. First off, we're looking at something that you may be somewhat familiar with. It's a library called MiniMasonry.js, and it's a lightweight, dependency-free library for building masonry layouts. Now, these are a great way to organize photos of different sizes, and it was popularized, of course, by social media websites. So it looks like something I'd love to do in a demo of an upcoming episode. I don't know. Let me know if you think this is still sort of a good layout style. Maybe it's been overused by different frameworks, but I do like that this is a pretty simple API and a pretty simple set of sort of controls for how you work with a masonry layout. I know that on occasion I have things of different sizes, especially photos. So I think this is a good solution for that type of for that type of problem. So it might be something that I demo. Let me know again if you want to see something like that. And then let's take a look at another framework that I thought was pretty interesting. I almost did a demo of this. This is one called Simple.css. Now, this framework really wants to be the simplest library you'll ever find. It's meant to give you a decent enough look with a very minimal amount of markup. Now, whereas in most other frameworks, they make you use complex CSS classes. Like if you use Bootstrap, you end up with a lot of classes just to make your layout work. If you're into like something like Tailwind, you get like a gazillion classes just to make something like a button. This one assumes that you're not going to be using any sort of classes at all. So the basics of it mean that you are going to sort of just use your regular markup. So you see, you don't really do anything special. You just create your headline, paragraphs, put stuff in a header, maybe create a footer, and it's going to take over your layout to make it look a lot nicer. So it's not exactly the most beautiful library for creating things, but I think it's a really good option if you want to get something up quickly. Perhaps you want to use GitHub Pages. You don't have a lot of time and you don't really want to put a lot of work. So this could be great for maybe some documentation or something super simple. Very, very cool. I might do a demo. I really wanted to do a demo of this one, so it shouldn't be a very difficult demo. It's just more putting up, preparing the assets for something like this. So spin up something very quick, a really nice looking sans serif stack, and it's got pretty good practices. So the CSS that it generates is trying to use a local font stack, for example, as much as possible, typographic best practices, and there's an easy way of creating a dark mode, which is pretty popular. I only run on dark mode, so I no longer know anything other than dark mode. It's a responsive frameworks, and it has a lot of sort of built-in defaults, super tiny, about 4K, and you can take a look here in this demo section to see what the different sizes of the headlines are and how they are set up in the CSS. So I really think there's going to be a couple of instances where I just don't have time to build something even in Bootstrap. Bootstrap looks okay by itself, but I think this looks a little bit better, and it has this kind of default navigation on the top. So next up, I want to talk about Rust, because every time I see a new framework, it looks like it's being done with the Rust programming language instead of JavaScript. So the problem with JavaScript is that it's a compiled language. So every time you open up a web page, it's got to take a look at all of the JavaScript, convert it, instantiate like the DOM, figure out what to do with it, and then it'll give you a page. And so what this is trying to solve is creating a sort of compiled version of JavaScript. So you don't write in JavaScript, but it will compile and it will allow the browser to understand it. Interestingly enough, according to Stack Overflow, Rust was the most loved programming languages, preferred by almost 90% of programmers for 6 years in a row. So there's got to be something interesting about it. I think that if you take a look at some of the projects that are being built with this, you have things like Dino, which is kind of like the successor or the want-to-be successor to Node.js. You can look at, for example, ESBuild, which is a tooling platform. It's also written in Rust. Rome, Parcel, Vite, all of them use this, not necessarily as the entire programming language, but sometimes it's just sort of a piece of the engine, the piece that needs to sort of parse a lot of data. It's really efficient for handling a lot of stuff. One of the features that I think people really love about it is how the memory manage works. It uses a really unique and automated management approach. I think it's a little bit early. This is a pretty new language. I mean, it has been around for at least like 6 years, because that's how long it's been at the top of the programmers' favorites in Stack Overflow. But I'm seeing it finally sort of used in more and more projects that I really love. So it might be something you want to take a look at learning. I think in the past, people have used Go as sort of an alternative to JavaScript that is a lot faster. So a lot of other projects are written in Go, but I'm seeing more and more companies like Vercel, also companies like Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google all start to work with this programming language if you want to be a developer that is prized for their knowledge. I think we might all end up writing a little bit of something like Rust in the future, because sometimes JavaScript just isn't not long enough, isn't fast enough. So next up, I want to show you another framework. It seems like we get a new framework just about every day, if not every week. So this is sort of interesting. It is a new framework based on Vue.js and Vite. And that's another thing that I'm noticing in the industry. A lot of stuff is using now Vite as the default build tool, which is great because it is my favorite. So I went through this whole process. I used Grunt, then I moved into Gulp, then I moved into, let's see, Gulp was hard to get rid of. So after that, I think I moved into Webpack, and I never liked Webpack. It was just confusing, and I can't stand confusing. So after Webpack, then I started sort of trying to figure out what the next thing was. I tried Rollup, Parcel. Really, I think the idea with those was creating a quick way to get up and running, but the configuration was a little bit difficult. And then I went into like the whole Snowpack, ESBuild, and I finally ended up with Vite. And you can see in some of my past episodes some demos of how that works. Actually, the demo that I'll be giving you today uses Vite. So definitely something that you may want to consider learning. It has a lot of interesting ideas that make it super fast. So it does make some decisions for you, but I agree with all the decisions that was made by the developers of Vue.js. And like Vue.js, it has a fantastic CLI that helps you install things. So definitely check it out. But this is a framework that's sort of based on that. One of the hot new sort of features in web development is this thing called partial hydration. Now, partial hydration essentially lets you ship zero JavaScript by default, and then any interactive bits that the framework sends you are opt-in, or they just appear when, or they load from the server when needed. So it's like it doesn't load any JavaScript until it notices that you're going to need JavaScript for something. So it could be an action that you perform on a page, you click on something, or you scroll to an area that requires some JavaScript. That's where these frameworks are, making a big difference, because it makes things load super quick. So this is a new idea that you see in a lot of frameworks like Astro. And so this is a, Iles is doing the same thing at a per component level. So it also looks at it at the page level as well. So there's additional sort of fanciness about what happens when nothing is loading. So sometimes you wait, if there's no actions happening on screen, that's a great time to load or preload some content. So it does use Vite, as I mentioned, as the build tool. So Vite, I think, uses Go for a lot of things. I do think it uses Rust, or they're looking at using Rust for some things as well. So, and there's also other frameworks that use the same approach, and so this is just sort of a new kind of framework that is sort of focused on Vue, and some of the features that it has. It does use Markdown really well, and one of the things that people really love about Markdown is this feature called MDX. I haven't really gotten into it. MDX is sort of like the ability to use some sort of JavaScript within your Markdown. I just don't really find a lot of need to add, something developy in my Markdown, but it could be useful. So if you're into that, I think that will be an interesting thing to get into. And then it does talk about the hydration of frameworks, and also the other thing that a lot of these frameworks have is interesting routing. So routing is like the URLs that you get when you go to a web page. So you say like /pages or /shop or whatever it is. The folder structure. So when you create your file structure in one of these frameworks, it's actually creating routes, and the routes can be passed variables to and from. So that is also something interesting. When these frameworks use file-based routing, it means that your folder structure becomes the routes or the way to get to data, which is actually pretty cool. And of course, it assumes that you're using Markdown for content. So I'm trying to decide what I'm going to move my blog at raybo.org, which right now uses like 11T, just a flat-based file system. And then Markdown, I don't really need a lot more, although I do have a search that I built in Vue 2 a while back, and I haven't updated it. So I'm looking at some of these frameworks, and this one looks pretty interesting. As you may know, one of my favorite frameworks is Vue, so I do like that this is Vue-based. So definitely something that you may want to look at. I may do something on Astro maybe next week. They just released a new update, and last week when I tried to sort of play with it, I wasn't able to get it going, so I chucked that to the fact that they were just trying to finish up a new version of it. All right, so the last framework that I want to cover, or tool that I want to cover, is called Remix. It came out just this Monday, so Remix is interesting because I've never seen anything sort of pre-marketed so strongly. I took a look at, I was just minding my own business and deciding on what I was going to cover. I'm trying to sort of figure out what I want to cover on the show, maybe a week in advance. And this framework was released, like I saw previews of it before. I got emails about it. I don't even know how, I got the emails. And then there was a lot of stuff on Twitter touting this framework. So this is a React-based framework that is really the evolution of a project that was a React router. So the same thing that I talked about, the way that you sort of organize your pages. Now, they used to charge big bucks for this framework, but now it's become an open source project that is free to use. So I'm not sure how these people are making money, but money isn't everything, maybe. I don't know. The killer feature here is that it kind of takes the web full circle. So if you remember the days where we handled most things on the server, this is sort of back with Remix. It takes the best of what we have learned about the new web, which is mostly like static content, simple routing, and super fast loading. And it puts everything, instead of running like, the way that a lot of new frameworks operate is by letting you pre-process all your pages, outputting a bunch of static content. This actually puts everything on the server. And it makes sense because the server can do a lot of things that your local file system can't do. So it can prefetch a lot of content. It can go ahead and generate all of the pages on demand. So like, instead of pre-rendering everything, maybe you can do some things that are rendered when people need them, and then cache so that everything becomes a lot faster. And this is one of the claims of this framework, that it is super fast. Now, one of the super interesting features, another one of the super interesting features, is this thing called nested routes. So they call it a cheat code. And if you are into Nintendo, you know what this is. So the idea here is that there, in every web page, you sort of have different sections of content that you mess with, right? So you may have like a navigation section, this sort of header section, and then different sort of pieces of content off them, especially on something like a dashboard. The idea here is that they allow you to create something called subroutes, and subroutes can load all of the pieces of content on your page separately. So this is kind of like what you see in modern build tools like you see something called HMR, or hot module replacement, where if you change a module, a piece of your page, it doesn't load the entire website. And this is why Vite is way better than something, one of the old build tools, because it is only loading not just what's on the page, but only a piece of the component that is being updated. So this is what subrouting is letting you do. It's letting you sort of componentize all of the pieces of your page into different subroutes. And so each one of the subroutes can load and update separately. So this is kind of the ultimate in hot module replacement. And that is, I think, a really good idea. I'm peeking at it. I'm not exactly like totally in love with it, so, but we'll see. I think my number one feature is simplicity. So let's see. It says to go over the buttons here. So I'm not sure. Oh, these buttons right here. Okay, so when you go, so see, it's fetching different pieces. So this is actually, I've used that version of the React router that they used to be, that they evolved from. And this is how they actually let you create these different routes, but they're taking advantage of the fact that if everything's on the server, then we can do things a lot faster, and we can use fetch to get the different pieces of the network. So I think like if you're super obsessed about speed and efficiency, then this is definitely a framework that you may want to look at. So let's see. I think that's all I have for right this minute before I go into my main demo. And let's go ahead and take a look at, see if there's any questions from anybody. So, hey, Javier, how's it going? Let's see. Can I put that up? Yeah. Hey, Javier. Sorry, it's okay if you're late. I haven't gotten into the main demo, so welcome again. So Javier is one of the regulars in the show. I think I put a couple of starter questions for people. So let's see. So I said, what is your favorite framework? I asked in the chat, just what is your favorite framework? And I can't put stuff up that is not up until after the show begins for some reason in this interface. So yeah, I would love to hear from you any sort of tools that you're really excited about. What did you think about any of these new things that I'm showing you? I'd love to get more interaction going in the topics here. So I don't really see anything else, but I wanted to kind of show you. Oh, hold on. Hello, Gilbert. Good to hear from you. So the next thing that I want to show you in sort of what I call the main event, I think I want to rename all these things. I'm not really sure about these names, but a few weeks ago, I discovered this other new framework called WindiCSS. And actually, this isn't it. So let's go to windycss.org. And I was sort of really excited about it. And so I decided to do the demo today on this framework. This framework is essentially, I want to say it's like a clone of TailwindCSS. So if you're Tailwind, this is going to be a really cool demo. If you're not, I think you're going to find out what Tailwind is about and what makes it kind of interesting. So hopefully you'll get a lot of out of what we have today. I really like this framework. I think it's sort of like an evolution of Tailwind. But you'll let me know if you think it's something that you may want to try. So let's get to it. When it was released, TailwindCSS was one of those frameworks that made everyone notice. But popularity breeds competition, and there's a new container that's been gaining ground called WindiCSS. Let's take a look at why you would want to consider it, and then we'll build something with it. Tailwind has a utility-based approach, which is a bit controversial. So you should definitely read this article by its creator to understand why he switched to this approach and why it might work for you. With Tailwind, you use a number of classes to define your layout. This is pretty close to using style attributes, but it does place some constraints on that, so it's a little bit more expressive as well as constrained. This makes Tailwind a really good solution for using with component-based architectures like React and Vue. Compared to something like Bootstrap, Tailwind doesn't have any built-in components, so things like modals, popovers, or toasts have to be built from scratch. So stick with Bootstrap if all you need is a way to build sites quickly. So if Tailwind CSS is so great, why would you want to switch to something like WindiCSS? Let me talk about these features and how they differ from Tailwind's. First, notice that WindiCSS is fully compatible with Tailwind CSS v2. So if you're used to the classes that you use in Tailwind, this is going to be pretty familiar to you. Now, on top of that, they do have some additional features, so we'll go through them, and I'll show you that some of these are addressed in later versions of Tailwind. Most of these come from the just-in-time version of Tailwind CSS. You can see that the just-in-time mode version of Tailwind CSS is a lot like WindiCSS, but there are some differences. Now, the first feature is value auto infer, which is available in just-in-time mode on Tailwind. This is really powerful because it allows you to use arbitrary values in your classes and put in whatever values you want right here in brackets. Next up is variant groups. Now these allow you to group variants together with a parentheses. This isn't yet on Tailwind CSS, and it's a pretty powerful feature. It lets you use a single hover variant and then in parentheses put all of the values that you want to modify. Next up is a feature called shortcuts. This lets you take a number of different classes like you see right here and combine them into a name like btn that you can use in your HTML. That makes it a lot easier to write repetitive content. Tailwind does let you do the same thing, but it's a little bit harder to apply. You create a layer targeting the components section of your code, and then you can create any shortcut you want using the apply keyword. The WindiCSS approach seems a little bit easier and more direct to me. It also supports CSS and JS syntax if you're into that sort of thing. There's also some improvements to responsive design. You can add a prefix like MD or LG to the utility, just like you can with Tailwind. However, you do have some options for custom ranges. So you can have things like greater or equal to than this breakpoint, smaller than this breakpoint, or exactly this breakpoint range directly in your HTML. You can also combine that with variant groups to make some really powerful media queries. There's also dark mode. That is something that Tailwind offers. However, there is an RTL mode, which is a right to left mode available to you if you're using a language that writes from the right side to the left side. So that's pretty cool. There's also an important prefix, just like with Tailwind, as well as directives, which you can use in Tailwind, and you can still use these directly in your CSS. So that's pretty useful. There is something called attributify mode. Now this is pretty interesting. You do have to turn it on because it is optional, but Once you turn it on, you can use any of the properties as attributes in your code. So you can say, for example, the BG is going to be this right here, and that makes them easier to modify with code. Finally, there is a visual analyzer, which you can use in a couple of different ways. It gives you some stats about what you're building. To use it, you can run an npx command like this, or you can install it locally. There's also a way to install it with the visual code extension, which I think makes a lot more sense than the other methods. Finally, another feature of WindiCSS are the number of integrations that it comes with. So it does offer a CLI, but it's pretty much there to just translate your code, so it has no live reloading features. If you want that, you're going to need to use something like Vite, Webpack, or Rollup. And it does have integration with frameworks like Vue.js as well as Svelte. Make sure you download the Visual Studio Code extension if you want to have features like autocomplete, syntax highlighting, and others. Let's take a look at how we can install WindiCSS. You can use any of these build tools right here. I'm going to use Vite, which is extremely fast and very popular right now. These instructions show you how to install the WindiCSS plugin for Vite, but not Vite itself. I'm going to open up my terminal. I'll make sure that I'm on the desktop. That's where I'll place all my files. And I'm going to run the npm init Vite latest command. Now this will fire up the CLI for Vite, and it's going to ask you a series of questions. I'm going to call my project WindiCSS, and for frameworks I'll just choose vanilla JavaScript, and I'll choose it again because I don't want to use TypeScript for this project. And it installs and creates a project for you. If we go to that project, we can open this up in Visual Studio Code. All right, so let's go ahead and install the Vite plugin. So for that, I'm going to pull up the terminal in VS Code. And I'll run the npmi minus the Vite plugin WindiCSS. And I'll also install WindiCSS itself right here. We'll need to add a config file for Vite. Let's go ahead and add this new file right here called vite.config.js, and this will import our WindiCSS library from our plugin. Then we'll use export default and specify that for the plugins we want to use WindiCSS. Now there's not going to be a configuration object right here, so then we'll go ahead and close this import. One more thing, in our main.js file, the default one that we get targets an app ID right here. We're not going to use any of that. We're also not going to use the styles that are provided because we don't really need them. So I'm just going to delete all this and select import virtual WindiCSS, which is how you start the library. Let's go ahead and run our live reload server for our project. So I'm going to pull up a terminal and do the npm run dev command. This will start up a server at localhost 3000, which I can open up in a browser. Now if you pull this up, it'll be completely blank. Let's go ahead and put these side by side. And if we go into our index HTML file, we can get rid of this, and we'll just type in a headline level 1 here, and we'll do a paragraph here with some lorem ipsum. You should see it come up, and if you've installed this correctly, none of the text should have any kind of format at all. Let's go ahead and add some additional files in here and clean up some of the other stuff. So I've got a couple of files that I've created here for you. This is just an images folder with this picture of an alien landscape. And I've also got another HTML file that has some different text. So I'm going to copy these into my WindiCSS folder. This will be the way the files look at the beginning of our project. Let's start working on how to make this look a little bit better using WindiCSS. The first thing you learn about Windy is that it is a complete clone of TailwindCSS. So you can use the same classes that you're used to if you're coming from Tailwind. For this headline level 1, I'm going to add some classes here. And I'll start with a text and then 6XL class. That's going to make the text a lot bigger. And you'll notice that I do have autocomplete working. That is because I have the extension installed for WindiCSS. So if you don't have that, just click on the extensions bar and look for WindiCSS, and make sure that you find this extension right here. and that you install it. Let's go ahead and hide the sidebar as well as the activity bar, just so that we have a little bit more room to work with. Now we can add some additional classes here. For the text, I'm going to make it a gray color so that it's not completely black. We'll set that to 800. We'll use the tracking tight, which is the spacing between letters, and we'll use the font extra bold size, which will make this really heavy. This H level 2 will have some additional classes as well. We'll use the pink 700. This is one of the advantages of TailwindCSS as well as Windy. It has a color palette that is a lot richer compared to something like Bootstrap. We'll add some additional classes for the paragraphs as well. A bit of padding at the top. We'll make sure it doesn't get any wider than a certain amount. One of the big complaints with something like WindiCSS and Tailwinds is that on occasion these classes can get really large. So you'll see that when I add the classes to the button right here. But that was certainly a lot of classes just to get the look of that button. And we're not even done yet, because you can also do what's called a variant, which means you can define how this is going to look when somebody rolls over the button in this case. Now there's a way to fix that, and I'll show you how it works in just a minute. Let's go ahead and finish with some of the other code that we have here. So we'll do some classes for the images as well. The class called object cover means that we set the height of the image, and then the contents will automatically fit in that space proportionally. Let's go ahead and work on the layout a little bit for this. So I'm going to add another div right here to make sure that we have some classes available that will contain both the image and the content before the image right now. So here we'll set this to a flex display, and we'll add a width of full, which means just make it the whole width of the items. So we're going to put all of these things in here. These should actually go outside of main. And then we're going to grab the image and main and put them in here. So we have two pieces of content that we want to insert inside this container. And our main container is going to have some classes. We're going to set the height of this to 100% of the height of the container, and then also set this to flex and make sure that it is a column. We'll align this text to the right and add a little bit of padding here and justify this to the center. Let's take a look. You can see sort of the layout is coming together a little bit. It's looking sort of nice. Now I'm going to modify my button so that it has an additional class here of self end. This will make the button not be the entire width of the container here. And I want to make sure that the second item, this image right here, grows and shrinks. So I'm going to add an additional div here, and we'll give it a class of flex1. So that class will allow this image, or whatever is in here really, to go ahead and grow and shrink. And so now what will happen is this image will disappear until I go to a wider sort of space, and it will appear depending on the width of the container, which I think looks really nice. It's a really nice responsive design layout that we got done with just a few classes. And I think that you can really see the power of what something like Tailwind will do, as well as, of course, WindiCSS. If you haven't seen Tailwinds before, this is probably driving you crazy. The fact that you have to create so many different classes in order to make a simple button probably scares you, because you think, what if I have to make a lot of these buttons, right? So the nice thing about both Tailwind and WindiCSS is that you can abstract these into something called shortcuts. Now the way that you do this is actually a little bit different between WindiCSS and Tailwind. With Windy, you have to create another file, and that's going to be called WindiConfig.js. And here we'll do the same thing that we do with most modules. We'll do export default, pass along an object, And here you put in shortcuts. Now this is different than TailwindCSS, and I think it's actually an improvement. So here we can define a shortcut called button and paste whatever we want into the definition for that shortcut. So I'm going to grab all the stuff from making the button. Now I'm going to leave margin top 4 because I want the button to automatically do everything other than set the margin. So I'll just go ahead and use this button right here, paste all the text for it. Now this is something that will probably require me to restart the server. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll restart it again, and you can see that now this has been applied right here. Working with WindiCSS is going to be so close to working with Tailwind. There are a few additional features. So if we want to do a hover state with multiple variants, one of the nice things is that you can put things in parentheses like this. And it's a much better way to combine multiple variants. Normally, you would have to put a hover colon for every one of these items, which is sort of a pain when you use Tailwind. Now, both of them will have the ability to do value auto infer, which is a really powerful feature. It means that instead of specifying predefined values here, so you can say here, for example, 6XL, and that makes it this size, and 7XL, which makes it this size. But if you wanted something in between with any of these values, you can put things in brackets and then just specify the value yourself. One big advantage in Windy is that the responsive system is a little better. So for example, you can specify a breakpoint that is less than a certain amount. So you could say at the less than MD breakpoint, then go ahead and use a different text size, and it makes it a lot easier to design things. If we make this 3M at the medium and smaller breakpoints, then when we make this bigger, it's going to make the text a little bit larger at the larger breakpoints. And that's something that is a little bit easier than in Tailwind. So if you're using the just-in-time version of TailwindCSS, then WindiCSS is not going to be that much of an improvement. Version 3 of TailwindCSS is releasing soon, so there's a couple of things in here that are a little bit better, but not that much. There's also, though, some intangibles. It does feel a lot faster. I haven't done any benchmarks, but I can tell you it just feels like it updates a lot quicker. And the integrations are very well done. Plus the website itself, if you go to the documentation, I think it's a little bit more concise. You can still hit Command K and find anything you want in the documentation, and it takes you directly there. I do wish the projects would merge, but one of the differences in Windy is that it's written in TypeScript. So what did you think about Windy? A couple of notes. I think that I really love what it's trying to do. However, if I were to compare it with the very latest versions of Tailwind, so I think we're in at 2.3 or 3.0 beta right now. I think that I couldn't say this for sure, but I think that they must have seen what each other is doing, and a lot of the features that you see that Windy really sort of revolutionized with were actually implemented into the just-in-time mode of Tailwind CSS. So I feel like Tailwind is just going to catch up eventually. As I mentioned, I think the intangibles are where Windy CSS shines. It feels a lot faster when you are modifying things. Maybe that could be related to the fact that I'm using Vite, and I don't know what the just-in-time compiler mode uses. I think one advantage of something like Tailwind CSS is that it now offers this really strange CDN version of the just-in-time compiler. So very latest versions use that. Once everything upgrades to version 3, it's going to be a new ball game, and that should be happening actually pretty soon. I expect it to happen before the end of the year. So I would say this is an interesting sort of framework to take a look at if you are thinking about implementing something. It is built with TypeScript, as I mentioned. So some people love that. It may give it a little bit of an edge in terms of speed. Interesting that somebody just sort of thinks, hey, I love Tailwind, but I think I can do better. And then they build this thing. It'd be interesting to see what happens once version 3.0 of Tailwind takes over. I don't know if this is something that I would spend a ton of time learning, but that's why I'm here. I'm here to sort of take a look at all these new things and figure out if it's something that people should be worrying about. Now, I do see some things in the comments. So Pranchu says that he's not seen what I'm doing. I'm not sure what that means. If you weren't able to see the video, I was monitoring my LinkedIn feed and I could see everything in here. So it may be something that you have to check on the replay. I'm simulcasting to a bunch of different networks. So I don't know if something happened, but yeah, hopefully you'll be able to sort of figure out what happened there. Prancho, I'm sorry about that. Let's see. Yeah, very good. Malo says, very good to try. Yeah, I think that, you know, the purpose of doing this toolbox is sort of to look at all the shiny new things, give them a shot, and then give you some feedback. And then I think like I'm trying to actually build something, not just sort of give you an overview demo of like what I saw on the website, but actually give you a good starting point. Like everything that I build, you can go to my GitHub repo, so github.com/planet of the web. And if you go to WindiCSS, so the URL is like right here. If you go to that WindiCSS, repo, then you'll be able to see and look at all the files that I'm working through the demo that I did. And there's actually two versions. There's a start version. So if you remember when I uploaded the images and the new index.html file, it's essentially everything at the moment that I copied the index and the images file folder. I felt like that's a good starting point if you wanted to sort of try it out yourself. That's a good place to get started with. So check that out if you want to play around with it. If you want to use this just directly on GitHub, you have to have code spaces because it does have a build process. But other than that, you can just go to code and open it with Visual Studio and you'll be able to play around with it. Otherwise, I think you could just hit period and then it'll tell you that it does have a build process. So it's going to need it's going to need to use code spaces. So thanks for watching. Let's see. Javier says, since you can add shortcuts, it makes better sense because I can't deal with more than, I know what you mean. The shortcuts are great in both Tailwind and Windy. I do love the way that Windy handles them. They are a little bit complicated in Tailwinds. I don't like how they work. So this is definitely an improvement. As I mentioned again, I think that hopefully Tailwind, I think that these two frameworks should just go ahead and merge. Like they're so close to each other. If you look at Tailwind 2 versus Tailwind like 2.1 and 2.3, 2.3 is like getting super close to this WindiCSS. So who knows what's going to happen in Windy in Tailwind's 3 and where Windy is going to go. They're so close that it's almost not worth using Windy other than, honestly, it feels a lot better. The documentation, I think, is, for me, better. I think that the Tailwind's documentation is prettier, but the documentation in Windy is just, it gives you what you need right away. There's less fluff. You have to scroll a lot less. That's all going to be dramatically different in the new version of Tailwind. So we'll see how all that sort of works itself out. Let's take a look at the time. Looks like I have some time for Q&A if you guys want to ask anything. Let's see. Other than that, I think that next week I am thinking about trying out Astro. So Astro is like the other thing that's been in the news. A lot of the same features that I talked about in Iles today are in Astro. They just made the switch to Vite. They just made the switch to some other, some other tooling that makes it a lot more compelling. The big new feature in something like Astro was that partial hydration sort of process. Everything is going to that. I think the important thing is not necessarily for you to worry about what the new shiny thing is, but sort of figure out when a framework introduces a new idea that is going to be adopted by everything, because what will happen is once an idea comes out that is really compelling, one of two things will happen. And this happened before with things like React. So Angular 1 came out, then I think Google stumbled with Angular 2 because of a lot of problems. But then React came out, and the new thing with React was the virtual DOM. Virtual DOM was revolutionary. Now, what happens when a new feature like that comes out is either the old frameworks will adopt it and absorb it, and then there's no reason for trying out this other thing. There's other things in React, of course, and or that the frameworks will diverge, and then there'll be two things, Angular and React. And that's really what happened. And so React sort of took off because the virtual DOM was such a great idea that people really thought that it would help them be more efficient. In the same way, I think that the new ideas that are coming out today are things like hot module replacement. That's what makes up any sort of additional tooling. So Iles, somebody asked a question about when can you find out more about Iles. So let's see, the website for Iles is, is Iles. It's a weird website. Iles-docs.netlify.app. So yeah, this is it right here. I don't know. I'm debating because I go through this thing where I like Vue better, but I know that React is really the dominant framework out there. So I always try to figure out in my head, should I be doing more stuff in Vue or should I be doing more stuff in React? I'm very indecisive. This is why I have this job and why I feel like I'm made for this sort of researching things. So it may be that I try Iles in a future episode, but I think next week I might go for Astro. As I mentioned, I tried it, a week and a half ago, and I just couldn't get it to work at all. So I'm like, okay, this is not ready yet. So I'm going to go back and I'll take a look at it. And if it doesn't work, maybe the next week's episode will be on Iles instead. I don't know. Let me know. Let's see. So this is a good question. When do you decide to implement a library on framework? Because it seems you need to learn something new every week. Yes, it's hard to keep. Yeah, and I think that this is like the purpose for the toolbox is just to let me be the guinea pig and try these things out. I think that I make a switch when I feel that something is going to make my life easier. So when I switch my blog to my blog is gone from a lot of things. But when I landed on 11T, I felt that 11T was just so much simpler and easier set up and easier to update that it was worth a switch. And the same thing, like right now, I'm looking at some of the new features in some of these frameworks, and I'm thinking it's about time for redesigning. And who knows what I might use? I might end up with something like Next.js. I like the routing that some of these new platforms give you. The routing is pretty cool, and I've used that before. So I think for me is trying to figure out is I probably try. Honestly, it's my job to try new things. But I think that when you look at my blog, which is rabo.org, my main thing there is okay. It's going to take some time for me to update this. So is there anything in there that makes it worthwhile? That's going to make my life easier. That's going to make me be able to do things quicker, or that's going to add some type of functionality that will improve the way that I do things and the way that my life works at. So I tend not to try something out unless I really think that it's going to be useful. Now, again, I'm in a different environment because it's literally my job to try these things out and determine whether or not I'm going to do a course on them. The way I determine that is, again, like what's the killer feature? I try to really quickly give you and identify the feature that is interesting here. So, for example, with React, it was the virtual DOM. With Vue, to me, was the first of all, Vue gave you back the script tag. You could load Vue up just by using the script tag, which is something you lost from Angular. But it was also the fact that I understood Vue like right away. Like things that I didn't like about React, like JSX, for example, which you got to remember to do class name every time instead of class. Those things were gone with Vue. And when I tried other things like Assembler CSS or Alpine, which I really loved. Alpine is super cool. It's sort of Alpine is like the Tailwind CSS of JavaScript. Like you don't have to imagine not having to do any JavaScript. or any, like how you don't have to do a style.css. Imagine if you didn't have to do any script.js and you could just do everything in your HTML. Really interesting idea. So I think maybe that answers a question. Like I make up my mind when I see something interesting that is going to make my life a lot easier. That's how I try something new. But it probably is going to be a lot different. I have some sites where I'm still using some extremely old frameworks. I have a site that honestly uses like PHP just for like server side includes. And if I don't need to update something, then I don't update it. Um, so that's maybe a good answer to that question. All right, so looks like we have 10 more minutes. I don't see any more questions. So like I said, I'm thinking right now about doing Astro next week, unless something happens that I can't figure it out or I don't get it to work. I'm really curious about those MDX style components, the partial hydration, really interesting ideas that I think are why people are moving or implementing these things in either new frameworks or taking the old frameworks and absorbing those ideas. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to follow me on LinkedIn, YouTube, or your favorite social media platform at Planet of the Web. I'm like almost everywhere at Planet of the Web. On LinkedIn, it's like LinkedIn/in/Planet of the Web. YouTube, it's like YouTube/Planet of the Web. Follow me and subscribe. And I'll see you next week for some more content and full stack tooling.